They say you can never truly know your neighbors until conflict hits. I wish I could tell you this story was a simple misunderstanding or a small-town quibble over fence heights. But the day my doorbell rang and I found two HOA representatives standing on my porch, arms folded and eyes hard, I sensed something far bigger was brewing. I couldn't have predicted just how much drama would unfold, but their complaints centered on a vital piece of my family's life, my deaf son's service dog. I live in Whispering Pines, a quaint subdivision that initially seemed like a slice of the American dream. Manicured lawns, rows of mailboxes, and a tree-lined boulevard that glistened in the autumn sun. My husband, Dave, and I moved here with our son, Jeremy, about a year ago, hoping for a peaceful, family-friendly environment. Jeremy lost his hearing at 3 due to a high fever and a bout of meningitis. That was one of the darkest times of our lives, watching him struggle and adapt to a silent world. By age 7, Jeremy had grown more confident, mostly because of his best friend and service dog, Milo, a gentle golden retriever trained to alert him to sounds like doorbells, alarms, and even squeaking kettle whistles. Though everyone seemed neighborly at first, it didn't take long for me to realize how heavily the residents relied on their homeowners association. They had committees for everything: hedge height, holiday decor, mailbox uniformity, even what day you should put up your American flag. I received a thick rulebook the day we moved in, but I assumed most of it would never matter to me. After all, what was there to argue about? I kept my grass trimmed and my yard tidy. I didn't plan on painting our house neon green or piling up junk cars in the driveway. How could a sweet, loyal golden retriever possibly become an issue? The morning everything changed, I answered the door in my bathrobe. Standing outside were two faces I barely recognized. One was Mary Wolfe, the brand new HOA president. She was in her 50s with the energy of a hawk on the hunt. Next to her was a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, introduced to me as Albert Fisher, the HOA's treasurer. Mary wasted no time making her intentions known. "Ms. Davenport," she said, voice clipped, "we've received numerous complaints about a dog making noise early in the morning. This is a quiet neighborhood, and you've been violating the association's strict pet policies." She handed me a typed letter that looked ominously official. "This is your formal notice of violation. The fine is $75, payable within 30 days, and any further infractions could result in legal action from the HOA. I was too stunned to say much, and I could sense Milo behind me, tail wagging uncertainly, as if he sensed the tension. Milo didn't bark much. He was trained to be especially calm and quiet so as not to startle Jeremy. At most, he'd issue a soft woof to alert Jeremy something was up, but we made sure to keep any excitement in the house. True, Milo was up early, like all dogs, but we took him for a quick walk and rarely let him bark. How could this be such a pressing issue? "Wait, a complaint?" I asked, glancing between the two. I've never heard of a single person mentioning Milo's barking. "He's a service dog." Mary's expression didn't soften. "Service dog, emotional support dog, whatever. We have rules, and dogs that create a disturbance must be dealt with accordingly. You should have submitted a special exemption request before bringing that dog here." "That's not how service dogs work," I said firmly. "Under federal law." Albert cut me off, tone condescending. "No need to get defensive. The HOA rules are quite clear. You can either pay the fine or face steeper consequences. We'll be expecting your check soon." They turned and left without another word, leaving me in the doorway, feeling a surge of shock and anger. I stared at the letter, my stomach churning. The document cited excessive dog noise and breach of community regulations, referencing some obscure line in the rulebook that I'd never even noticed. I wondered if it was a misunderstanding, if maybe Mary and Albert just needed some education on what a service dog is and does. After all, this dog wasn't a whim. Milo was vital to Jeremy's independence. He was like a second set of ears for my son. When Dave came downstairs a few minutes later, I showed him the notice. He took off his reading glasses and shook his head. "This is insane. Milo never causes problems. We can't let them do this." I agreed, but part of me hoped it was just a one-off misunderstanding. Maybe if we brought Jeremy's disability paperwork and Milo's service dog certification to the next HOA meeting, we could clear this up amicably. Dave shrugged. They can't fine us for having a service dog. That's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, if I'm not mistaken. We were both right, and we were also naive, because it turned out the HOA wasn't interested in abiding by ADA guidelines or hearing our explanations. They had their rules, and in their eyes, we were guilty of disturbing the meticulously curated peace of Whispering Pines. The official letter was only the first of many. Weeks later, they demand even more. But in that moment, I was still clinging to the belief in neighborly decency. I'll gather all our paperwork, I told Dave. Let's bring it to the next meeting and reason with them. I patted Milo's head and ruffled his ears. He gazed up at me with those trusting brown eyes. Jeremy came bounding into the hallway, excited for breakfast, and signed to me, "Good morning, Mom. I'm hungry." I couldn't help but smile. If only the HOA reps could see Jeremy's sweet face and how Milo helped him every day, they'd understand. Maybe they'd empathize. But that's the thing about HOAs. Empathy isn't usually part of the guidelines. A few days later, Dave and I arrived at the monthly HOA meeting held in the Whispering Pines Community Center. We carried a neat folder containing copies of Jeremy's medical records, proof of Milo's training, and even references for neighbors back at our old house who knew Milo was the calmest dog on the planet. The plan was to share all this with Mary, Albert, and anyone else on the board. If they understood our situation, surely they'd waive the fine and chalk this up to a misunderstanding. As we walked in, my heart sank. The place reminded me more of a courtroom than a friendly association gathering. The board members sat in a row at a long table, each armed with a stack of documents. Mary Wolfe presided from the center, a stern expression on her face. Several seats were filled by neighbors I recognized, but didn't know well, residents looking to address their own concerns or just keep up with community business. After some discussion about landscaping budgets and upcoming Halloween decorations, Mary cleared her throat. Next on the agenda is a noise violation against the Davenports for repeated dog barking and failure to comply with pet ownership rules. I swallowed hard. We had provided every item of documentation they needed. Still, Mary had launched into her official stance before we'd even spoken. "It has come to our attention," she continued, "that the residents have brought an animal onto the property that, according to multiple complaints, has been making noise at various hours. Additionally, they have not followed the standard procedure for registering the dog with our association." I raised my hand. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "With all due respect, the dog in question is my son's service animal. Jeremy is deaf, and Milo is trained to assist him in daily life. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Milo is legally permitted to accompany Jeremy anywhere, regardless of housing rules." Mary's lips pursed. She peered over her wire-rimmed glasses. "We're aware of that law. However, our rules stipulate that any animal causing disruption can be subject to fines. The ADA doesn't allow for continuous disturbance, and we have a community to protect. These complaints have been thoroughly documented." Dave stepped up. "May I see these complaints? We've never heard from a single neighbor about Milo being a nuisance, and we're always outside with him. He hardly barks." Albert flipped through a file. "We have written statement from 6 neighbors saying they hear the dog barking as early as 5 in the morning." I frowned. 5 in the morning was around the time Dave left for work, but Milo never barked. Did they mean those times he whined or even let out one short bark to alert Jeremy that Dave was leaving the house? Was that worth a formal complaint? Even more puzzling was that we'd never spoken to these neighbors about it. No courtesy knock on the door. No friendly, "Hey, your dog's been loud. Can you keep him quiet?" Instead, they went straight to the HOA. "Look," I said, "I'd really like to resolve this respectfully. We've brought proof that Milo is a legitimate service dog. He's not a pet. He's a working dog, and Jeremy's well-being depends on him. Is there a compromise we can reach?" Mary's mouth was set in a firm line. "The compromise is that you pay the fine for the violation and register your dog through the HOA's standard process, including a $200 pet deposit. That's not negotiable." My blood started to boil. But a service dog is exempt from pet fees under federal law. She cut me off. That may be, but Whispering Pines has its own bylaws. We're not in violation of any federal statute. This is a matter of community governance. One of the older gentlemen in the audience raised his hand. Excuse me, Ms. Wolf. Is it possible these folks are telling the truth? This is a service dog, so maybe the rules need some adjusting. Mary gave him a withering glare. Mr. Billings, I appreciate your input, but the board has voted unanimously. Let's move on. Just like that, I realized these people weren't interested in hearing me out. This was about control. The HOA's authority was the rule of the land, and if we didn't comply, they intended to make life miserable. My fists clenched in frustration. We won't pay, Dave said quietly, and we don't owe you a deposit. Milo's not a regular pet. He's a service dog protected by federal law. Mary shrugged. That's your choice, but it'll only result in late fees and, eventually, legal action. She turned to the rest of the board. Next agenda item? And with that, we were dismissed like unruly children. We left the meeting to a low hum of whispers from the onlookers. That older gentleman, Mr. Billings, caught my eye and gave me a slight nod of sympathy, but that was the only kindness offered in the entire room. Outside, I took a shaky breath. Dave looked at me gravely. Well, that went about as bad as it could have. I nodded, tears threatening to blur my vision. I can't believe this. All we want is for Jeremy to have the support he needs. And they act like we're criminals. We promised each other we'd stand firm on our rights, no matter what. This wasn't about just the money. It was about protecting our son and ensuring that families with disabilities aren't bullied into compliance. But as the weeks dragged on, the situation only escalated. Additional fines started arriving in the mail. First, it was $75. Then it was $150 for a repeated violation. Another notice tacked on a $50 late fee. We tried to ignore them, certain that the law was on our side. But the letters kept coming, each one threatening legal action if we didn't pay. And then the rumors started. We'd hear from distant neighbors that Mary Wolf was calling us troublemakers, telling everyone we were trying to game the system by calling Milo a service dog. Someone even said she claimed she saw me walking the dog without Jeremy one afternoon, as if that proved our entire story was some elaborate scam. I never felt so targeted in my own home. Our once peaceful community began to feel like a place of silent stares and whispered judgments. Children who used to wave at Jeremy on the school bus now looked away. Invitations to neighborhood events dried up. The final straw came when we received a letter stating we were officially in breach of contract with Whispering Pines, and if we didn't pay all outstanding fees, we'd be taken to court. It felt like an anvil hanging over our heads. Dave and I had late-night discussions about whether we should cave and pay just to keep the peace. But every time I looked at Jeremy, doing his homework with Milo, quietly lying at his feet, my resolve hardened. We were within our rights, and we were prepared to fight. Little did I know, that fight would get uglier than anything I'd ever experienced. The day I found a pink slip of paper taped to our front door, my nerves were already frayed. The HOA had finally made good on their threat. We were being sued in small claims court for unpaid fines. Their formal complaint alleged that we were in repeated violation of community guidelines and refused to comply with a reasonable registration requirement. They were asking for a sum totaling nearly $1,000, with court fees tacked on for good measure. I was furious, but a part of me also felt vulnerable and afraid. My parents had always told me stories about how powerful HOAs could be if they chose to flex their muscles. Sure enough, Mary Wolf and her board seemed determined to win at all costs. We hired an attorney named Rebecca Martinez. She specialized in housing discrimination cases, and as soon as I shared the situation, she looked at me, aghast. This is a clear-cut case of violation of federal disability law. We'll countersue for damages and attorney fees. You need to understand you hold the upper hand here, legally speaking. While that was reassuring, it didn't ease the knot in my stomach every time I passed Mary on the street or received yet another glare from my neighbors. The gossip that we were dragging the HOA into court spread like wildfire. People who once offered polite waves became cold and aloof. A rumor sprang up that we were money-hungry planning to cash in on some frivolous lawsuit. It was difficult to attend yard sales or go to the local grocery store without hearing whispers. That's her. She's the one causing trouble with the HOA. Days before the court date, something happened that made my blood run cold. Jeremy was playing in the yard with Milo, tossing a squeaky toy. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where leaves fluttered down the street and the warm sun made everything feel almost normal. Suddenly, Jeremy ran inside with tears in his eyes, signing furiously. I could make out the panic in his gestures right away. He explained that a neighbor, someone I didn't recognize, had marched up to our yard and scolded him. This stranger apparently told Jeremy it was wrong to trick the neighborhood into believing he was deaf just so we could keep a dog. My son was devastated. He felt singled out, misunderstood, and even a little scared. Milo picked up on his distress, pressing close to his side for comfort. I held Jeremy tight, anger roiling in my gut. Who would accuse a child of faking a disability? It dawned on me that Mary Wolf's rumors were spiraling into something bigger, an ugly campaign of harassment. The part that truly broke my heart was watching Jeremy sign to me. Why do they hate Milo? Milo is good. How was I supposed to explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes people are cruel because they're afraid of losing control? That moment solidified my determination. I promised Jeremy we would fight back with everything we had. On the morning of the court hearing, Dave and I dressed in our best business attire, nerves thrumming beneath our calm exteriors. Rebecca joined us in the small, wood-paneled courtroom, which smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The HOA had brought its own attorney, a tall man with slick-back hair who wore an expensive navy suit. Mary Wolf sat behind him, her posture stiff as if she were carved out of stone, and Albert Fisher was by her side, flipping through a binder of documents. The judge, an older gentleman with kind but tired eyes, called the session to order. The HOA's attorney launched into a monologue about the sanctity of community guidelines, how the residents of Whispering Pines paid to live in a peaceful, regulation-abiding environment, and how my family's refusal to pay the fines disrupted the entire neighborhood's tranquility. Then it was Rebecca's turn. She stood, poised and controlled, reminding the court of the federal protections guaranteed by the Americans with Disabilities Act. She explained that a service animal cannot be subjected to pet deposits or banned from a residence, that individuals with disabilities have the right to reasonable accommodations, and that the HOA's demand for payment was in direct conflict with federal law. Mary's attorney tried to argue that the barking complaints proved Milo wasn't a properly trained service dog. But Rebecca calmly presented evidence, including veterinarian certificates, training school credentials, and even a brief video clip demonstrating how Milo behaved when signaling Jeremy. We also brought neighbor testimonials, those who were still on our side, attesting that Milo was quiet and well-behaved. I was surprised to see Mr. Billings step up to the stand. The same gentleman who tried to speak up at the HOA meeting was willing to testify on our behalf. He spoke passionately about seeing Jeremy and Milo together, how gentle and obedient the dog was, and how the kid's face lights up whenever that dog is around. He added, in a voice that carried a certain moral weight, I don't see this as a disruption at all. If anything, it's heartwarming. The judge listened patiently, occasionally scribbling notes. At the end, he addressed the courtroom with a measured tone. This is a straightforward conflict between federal law and an HOA's bylaws. Let me be very clear. Federal disability law supersedes local housing rules. If this dog is indeed a legitimate service animal, a fact that has been quite convincingly demonstrated here, then the HOA has no legal standing to impose fines related to its presence. Relief flooded through me, but the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, the plaintiff's request for damages in the form of fines is denied. We must also consider the defendant's counterclaim of discrimination. He looked sternly at Mary and Albert. HOAs do not have the right to discriminate against residents with disabilities. If they do, they could be held liable for damages. Mary looked uncharacteristically rattled. Her attorney fidgeted, lips pressed together. I stole a quick glance at Dave, who gave me a small nod that said, "We've got this." After some deliberation, The judge said he would issue a final ruling in 2 weeks. Until then, we were free of any obligation to pay fines. We left that day feeling like we'd finally been heard. But we still didn't know what the damage award might be, or if the judge would rule in favor of our counterclaim. That would come later, and it turned out the final judgment would surprise everyone. 2 weeks felt like 2 months as we waited for the judge's final decision. Every day, the mailbox was a source of anxiety. I began to second-guess everything. Had we collected enough evidence, made a strong enough case? But then I'd remember Jeremy's tearful face when that stranger accused him of faking deafness, or the harassment we'd endured from the HOA, and my resolve would return. We were in the right. Now it was just a matter of trusting the legal system. When the letter finally arrived, I was in the middle of folding laundry. I saw the official court seal on the envelope, and my hand started shaking. Dave came up behind me, placed a steady hand on my shoulder, and nodded. I tore it open, scanning the pages. The first lines were straightforward. Our family was not required to pay any of the HOA's fines. Whispering Pines had, indeed, violated the Americans with Disabilities Act by imposing those fees on a recognized service dog. That part was a massive relief. But then came the kicker. The judge also found that the HOA's actions, including persistent fines, threats of legal action, and refusal to acknowledge the dog's legal status, constituted discrimination under federal law. As a result, the court awarded our family damages. A sum of $10,000 was to be paid by the HOA to cover our legal fees and compensation for the emotional distress caused by their actions. I read that paragraph 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. "They have to pay us," I breathed. Dave's eyes widened. He grabbed the letter, reading it for himself. Then he let out a laugh of pure, unfiltered relief. Rebecca came over that afternoon to go through the judgment details. She confirmed that the decision was final unless the HOA wanted to pursue an appeal, which would be costly and likely unsuccessful. As she talked, a wave of exhaustion mingled with triumph washed over me. We'd done it. We stood up for Jeremy's rights, and we won. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. At first, Mary Wolfe refused to speak to us. I heard from a neighbor that she was fuming, claiming she would fight the ruling. But a week later, an official letter from the HOA arrived, stating they would comply with the court's decision. They had no choice. Whispering Pines would pay the judgment, and the board offered a grudging apology. I couldn't help feeling victorious, but also a bit saddened by how everything had gone down. Whispering Pines was supposed to be our home, a place where Jeremy could grow up feeling safe. I had hoped for a future filled with block parties and friendly chats at the mailbox. Instead, we ended up in a legal battle that exposed the worst in some people. Even after the settlement, tensions lingered. Mary stayed on as HOA president, though I suspect her popularity dipped among residents who realized she'd cost them money. Albert Fisher resigned from his treasurer position shortly after. A few neighbors who had been cold or distant now approached me hesitantly, murmuring awkward apologies or explaining that they were pressured by the board. One day, about a month after the ruling, I opened the door to find Mr. Billings, the gentleman who'd testified in court, standing on my porch. He held a plate of homemade cookies and looked nervous. "I just want to say I'm sorry you had to go through all that," he said. "I'm glad you stood up for your boy. It was the right thing to do." I smiled, inviting him in for a cup of coffee. Jeremy was in the living room, practicing piano lessons he was learning through vibration and visual cues. Milo was perched at his side, ears perked, always vigilant. Mr. Billings watched, fascinated, as Jeremy's fingers found the right keys. "Remarkable," he said softly. "He doesn't let anything stop him, does he?" I followed his gaze. Jeremy paused when he noticed us, and I gave him a thumbs up. He returned it with a grin. Mr. Billings patted my shoulder gently. "You and your husband are good parents. I'm sorry the HOA made life difficult. Let's hope the neighborhood learns from this." In the months that followed, life settled into a new normal. Dave and I used a portion of the damages to set up a small college fund for Jeremy. We also donated some to an organization that trains service dogs for deaf and hard-of-hearing children, because we realized how fortunate we were to have the resources to fight the HOA in the first place. Not everyone in our situation could afford an attorney or stand their ground when the threat of legal fees looms. Gradually, the ugliness receded. Some folks came around to appreciate Milo for what he was, a well-trained, essential companion. Jeremy learned a tough lesson about prejudice, but he also discovered the importance of perseverance. Even though the legal battle was draining, it helped reinforce to him that he has rights just like everyone else, and that those rights are worth defending. I'd like to say Mary Wolfe learned her lesson, but truthfully, I barely see her around anymore. She avoids us at community gatherings, and when we pass on the street, she looks the other way. Part of me wants to forgive and forget, but another part knows we'll never be close. Sometimes people like Mary never admit wrongdoing, even when the court forces their hand. Despite it all, Jeremy's happy. He's thriving in school. He loves his teachers and has made friends. And Milo remains the loyal companion he's always been. If anything, this experience strengthened that bond. I see them together every day, and my heart swells with gratitude. We fought a battle for them, and we won. These days, when the doorbell rings, I don't tense up, expecting another wave of harassment. Instead, I open the door to see the mailman or a friendly neighbor dropping off a pie. Milo sits calmly beside me, and Jeremy peers around my shoulder, curious as always. Life is quieter now, in the best possible way. Sometimes, when I'm driving into whispering pines, passing the perfectly manicured lawns and neatly arranged mailboxes, I recall the time I dreamed this place would be a peaceful retreat for my family. Ironically, it took a legal storm for us to find our real peace. But we got there in our own way. And the next time someone tries to stand between Jeremy and the future he deserves, I won't hesitate to stand up and fight all over again. Because if this ordeal taught me anything, it's that our rights aren't optional, and neither is our resolve to protect them. End of story.